Good morning. I was told to remind you all that there are sign-in sheets in the back at the registration table. So if you would, please make sure that you add your name to those rolls. Dr. John Henry Clark, master scholar from Union Springs, Alabama, used to say that history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells of people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. Most important, history tells of people where they still must go and what they still must be. So I encourage all of us here today to use this very important conversation about the Voting Rights Act as a vehicle to take us to that place where we still must go. Given the current realities of American government, there couldn't be a more opportune time to have such a vital conversation. We've recently seen the Supreme Court take measures to weaken the voting rights of certain people and all but eradicate affirmative action. Just this month, we've witnessed cuts to social welfare programs and the serious reality of the government shutdown. At one point, African Americans identified the federal government as an ally to civil rights causes. But in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King wrote a book called Why We Can't Wait. And in that volume, he fiercely criticized the American government's failure to live up to its promise. Although we minimized him to one day, we relegate him to one speech, and we marginalize him to one line, I have a dream. Even in that speech, he criticized the government's betrayal, and he described it as a bad check that had come back insufficient funds. So it is my suspicion that 50 years later, Dr. King would be pleased that we're having this conversation, particularly about legislation that his determined labor helped bring into reality. So again, it is my prayer that something is said today by you perhaps, because we know in the African tradition, communication-centered learning is bilateral. So I'm hoping that we get comments from you all in the audience, and perhaps something that is said by these extraordinary scholars on this panel, that the words that are exchanged here today live up to Dr. John Henry Clark's meaning of history, which is to have us become what it is that we still must become and go to those places where we still must go. At this point, I ask you to prepare your hearts for invocation, which will be given by Dr. Robert White, followed by greetings from Dr. Janice Franklin.
Let us bow our heads. We invoke the presence of the Most High at this time, the one who has established unity in diversity. We petition that business be established, that hearts be open to reason and logic and truth. And we ask this in his name, amen.
Good morning. I bring you greetings on behalf of the Steering Committee of the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University. It is indeed an honor for me to welcome you as we officially begin with this symposium, our celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, to be celebrated in 2015. I would like to open today's program by thanking all of you for your attendance. And I would like to give special thanks to our partners within the university, including our president, Dr. William Harris, provost, Leon Wilson, and executive vice president, John Knight. The National Center is also grateful for funding from the Alabama Humanities Foundation that has helped to make this program possible. We extend further appreciation to historians Dr. Dorothy Autry and to Dr. Howard Robinson for their work to ensure that the great history of voting rights in Alabama is a part of the academic discourse here at Alabama State University. In a democracy, it is both a necessity and an imperative that its citizens are informed and committed to its principles of fairness, justice, and the right of one man, one vote. In fact, news reporter Walter Cronkite said it best when he stated that there is nothing more dangerous than ignorance in a democratic society. It is for this purpose that we gather here today to inform, preserve, and teach the lessons of voting rights history that is at the heart of the National Center's mission to serve as a research center and a repository for the study of civil rights and African American culture. As we march toward the 50th celebrations, we are proud to be the site for the National Park Service's Interpretive Center that will honor ASU's role in the ongoing struggle for voting rights. We welcome you, and we hope that this symposium will enlighten you and that you enjoy our program today. Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. White for providing the invocation today. Well, my name is Dr. Howard Robinson. I am the archivist at Alabama State, and I teach in the History and Political Science Department, and I work with the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture. And we're delighted to have you here today. Again, I want to thank Dr. White for providing the invocation today. And although he is a worthy choice, he wasn't our first choice. The individual who was to provide our invocation was Reverend Richard Boone. Reverend Richard Boone came to our attention some years ago when we were looking into the modern civil rights movement and the role that particularly people at Alabama State played in organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Montgomery Improvement Association, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Reverend Boone's name kept on appearing in the literature, and he seemed to be an important voice for calling for freedom and liberty and equality. We got a chance to meet and work with Reverend Boone. We worked with him for some years. He was an instrumental part, he became an instrumental part of what the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture was doing. He served on a number of our panels. He was a trusted advisor. He was a mentor. And he lent his voice to sort of echo the role that this city, this school, and these people played in helping this nation realize the true meaning of liberty, equality, justice. So we pay homage today. Reverend Boone passed away. He is a fallen hero, and I want to take a moment to reflect on those individuals who have committed their lives so that we could enjoy the blessings of liberty. I think about when I survey the audience, I want to pay particular attention to, we're talking today about the historical context for the Voting Rights Act and the Voting Rights Campaign. And so you represent the beneficiaries of that campaign, and that you have now or are going to exercise the right to vote. And you're going to do that as a matter of course. It's your right as an American citizen. But this right was not always extended to persons of African descent. And so we have also among us people who participated in that movement, who sacrificed, who walked, who marched, who were beat, and who served time in jail in order to move that ideal of American liberty and justice forward. I'd like to recognize those individuals in the audience who participated in the modern civil rights movement. Could you please stand up? Reverend Gratz, Dr. Patty. Yes. scandal. And so we have these individuals who are amongst us, still amongst us, who can provide us with a first-hand account of the episodes of the modern civil rights movement. And actually, our second symposium will deal with exactly that. And so hopefully, Dr. Patton will serve on that second symposium and will be amongst a number of individuals who participated in the modern civil rights movement and who will share their experiences. For almost 2 centuries, black people waged a relentless struggle for first-class citizenship in the United States. They understood that the right to vote and the opportunity to hold elective office lay at the very foundation of what it means to be a citizen. Since the nation's origins in the late 18th century, a debate over the meaning of citizenship clouded the status of African Americans. They questioned what the Declaration of Independence meant when it said, all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Who were the framers of the Constitution talking about when they severed the ties with England and entered into a more perfect union to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity? While the 1787 United States Constitution forbids religious tests as a prerequisite for voting, it leaves other qualifications for voting to the discretion of the individual states. In the Revolutionary War period, several northeastern states embraced the idea of freedom across racial lines. And like Massachusetts, Vermont, and Maine, they wrote into their state constitutions provisions that did not bar blacks from voting. In the early republic, other states wrestled over this question. And while no slaves voted, various states, including Delaware, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania, conferred voting privileges to free black men in the years after the Revolutionary War. A number of these states, including New York, New Jersey, then rolled back the franchise by the end of the 1820s. And in the South, where a growing enslaved population was considered chattel property, a few free blacks who were initially able to vote in states like North Carolina and Tennessee saw these privileges revoked by the mid-1830s. Deep South states like Alabama and Mississippi demonstrated more consistency by not allowing any blacks to vote before the Civil War. In 1857, Roger B. Taney, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, attempted to answer the question of black citizenship in the infamous Dred Scott decision. There, he ruled that although Dred Scott lived in states and territories that prohibited slavery, Scott had no standing to sue in the United States court. For he nor any person of African descent were, according to Chief Justice Taney, an American citizen. Taney ruled that blacks were altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. In part, this interpretation of black citizenship would be challenged as a result of the Civil War. The Civil War period marked a watershed in black political participation. Despite widespread hostility and opposition throughout the South, after the war, freedmen voted and held offices at the local, state, and national levels. In the years between 1865 and 1877, the United States government attempted to ensure that freedmen were able to participate in the political life of their communities and nation. Federal legislation, including the Reconstruction Act of 1867, the 14th Amendment, and the Force Acts of 1878 and 1871, all intended to extend the franchise to make office holding available to the newly freed black population. Moreover, the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, embedded the right of black men to vote in the nation's organic law. In this period, freedmen were not passive observers. In Alabama, they held conventions in Montgomery and Mobile, where they expressed the desire to enjoy first-class citizenship. For the first time, black men voted in large numbers throughout the South. In Alabama, 104,000 blacks registered to vote in 1867, compared to 67,000 whites. Freedmen participated in writing the 1868 state constitution and were elected to the United States Congress and occupied seats in the Alabama State House, and they sat on city councils and boards of education. These Reconstruction legislators laid the foundation for public education, allotted resources for railroad development, and they attempted to establish the framework for equality. At no time, however, did indigenous white population peaceably accept black political participation. Wholesale violence and corruption marred this extraordinary attempt at racial inclusion. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan unleashed a reign of terror and violence that forced blacks out of the polling places and brutalized black citizens, black elected representatives, and their white allies. In November 1874, the white Democrats in Alabama successfully regained control of the state, thereby ending Reconstruction in Alabama and rolling back reforms made over the previous 6 years. A negotiated truce between Democrats and Republicans in the wake of the contested presidential campaign of 1876 brought Reconstruction to an end throughout the nation, giving white Southerners free rein to force the black population into a permanent underclass. I wanted to set a historical foundation for the effort black folks or black people in the United States to move towards first-class citizenship and the right to vote. The purpose of today's activity, or the purpose of today's symposium, is to illustrate that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Voting Rights Campaign of 1965 is the culmination of 2 centuries of voting agitation. Our panelists today are going to recap and to highlight elements of that long struggle towards voting rights and political participation. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Alecia Hoffman. I'm an instructor of political science here at Alabama State University. My purpose this morning is to serve as moderator as well as discussant for this panel. So I want to just give you all a brief overview of what this panel will be doing and how we will proceed forward this morning. We're going to, of course, discuss the importance of the Voting Rights Act and also importance of how voting rights has proceeded from 1865 up to 1930. What the panelists will be doing this morning is they will be discussing their talks or their papers. They will be given 20 minutes, each panelist on the up here at the table, and then from there I will give a discussion of each of the major points that was covered by the panelists here at this table. Furthermore, in looking at the purpose of this panel, what we're going to do is examine the struggles that African Americans have endured to obtain access to the ballot box. This is the first panel, as I mentioned, that will take place this morning. The second panel will, of course, occur at 1:00 p.m. today after lunch, and that panel will discuss the events that occurred dealing with voting rights after the 1930s and moving up into the 1950s. So I thank you all for coming, and I ask that you please obtain some good notes from this lecture and enjoy.
Before we begin, I am going to introduce our distinguished panel. Let me just say this before I do that, though. I think what I do in the classroom is fairly important. And so when I was asked to perhaps disrupt my plans for class today, I was a bit hesitant, but then when I looked and saw who the contributors were to the panel this morning, I realized that we were in expert hands, and today was as good a day as any to have class in a different space, in a different way. So that said, be ye reminded that if you are in Dr. Brown's class, you should be taking notes, okay? If you don't have pen and paper, take out your phone and use the Steve Jobs technology that we've been blessed with in the 20th century. Now, our experts include Dr. Bertis English, Professor of History and Associate Dean, College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. His expert commentary will focus on voting rights in Alabama during the Reconstruction era. We also have, contributing to our panel today, Dr. Byrdie Larkin, Professor of Political Science. Her expert commentary will focus on the challenge to African American voting rights in Alabama during the era of disenfranchisement. We also have Dr. Robert J. Norrell, Professor of History. His expert commentary will focus on African American voting rights in Alabama during the early 20th century, 1900 to 1930.
Speaking of disruptions, I realize that we have a lot more attendees, which is a good thing than what was planned for. So if we can take just a break, my crew will be bringing in chairs to place along the back of the room. So rather than disrupt the speaker, if we could just take a minute.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Joseph Caver, and I must apologize. I had put 9:30 on my calendar. It's 9 o'clock. Of course, I'm a retiree, and since I've retired, I normally don't schedule anything for mornings. Really. So, I'm here to serve as your moderator, and it is an honor to work with this distinguished panel and discussing. This is a very important chapter in our history, and with the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act coming our way in less than 2 years, what better opportunity it is to gather such a group today to discuss this important issue. Now, the panel has already been assigned topics or areas of discussion, and we will follow as printed in the program, and I assume that Ms. Hoffman is up first. She's the discussant, and so I will give the mic to her. You'll be finished? Okay. Let's start with Dr. English. Okay.
Good morning. Before I commence talking about the topic that is being designated to me, I would like to thank, on behalf of all panelists and all of the participants, Dr. Janice Franklin and the National Center for undertaking this very important activity. I also want to thank you who are here, particularly students, because Dr. Brown's mandate notwithstanding, you still could have chosen to be someplace else. You didn't have to come to class this particular day. But simply your willingness to come here to listen to us, I think, speaks volumes about the forward progression of Alabama State University, notwithstanding some statements that have been made in the public eye recently. My talk is entitled Trite But True, African American Voting Trends in Alabama During the First Reconstruction, and I will try to align it as well as I can with the topic that's printed in the program, and I will try as best as I can to keep this talk to at least 40 minutes. I thought that might get your attention. The two young ladies in the front look like, has he lost his mind? 40? That's 20 times 2. In the wake of the Civil War, the American government developed the presidential, radical, and congressional plans of Reconstruction to unify the country. President Andrew Johnson began the process by appointing provisional governors to former Confederate states. In Alabama, the man chosen for the position was Lewis Parsons, a one-time secession opponent and the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, a principal leader of the First Great Awakening. Parsons, however, failed to lead even a moderate awakening in post-Civil War Alabama. Consistent with Johnson's Reconstruction plan, most pre-war laws remained on the books. Likewise, the vast majority of state leaders retained their posts even though a number of them had been Confederate office holders. Little was done to change the general condition of former slaves, who constituted almost 50% of the total population, and several lawmakers advocated preserving slavery. To the average white Alabamian, it seemed, emancipation merely altered blacks' legal status. The Jacksonville Republican, a Democratic newspaper in Calhoun County, confirmed this belief years later. According to the newspaper, former slaves were as fit to make laws as an elephant to teach music. The previous statement reflected the lost cause mythology that permeated Alabama following the Confederate surrender in April 1865. When the state's all-white Constitutional Convention assembled during the following September, delegates invalidated secession, but they decided that only white men could become state legislators. Furthermore, representation to the state legislature would be based entirely on the white population. Henceforth, black citizens could serve as witnesses in court cases that involved whites, but interracial marriages would be illegal. And because of a split between wealthy white planters who thought they could control the black vote and small white merchants and farmers who opposed black voting altogether, every discussion about universal suffrage was tabled. This is a white man's government and a white man's state, the Huntsville advocate declared. We are opposed to any changes in the convention except those that are necessary to get Alabama into the Union again. The new state constitution typified this belief. Its drafters accepted Section 1 of the 13th Amendment, which prohibited a citizen from involuntary servitude unless he or she was tried and duly convicted of a crime, but they rejected Section 2, which gave Congress the power to enforce the amendment through appropriate legislation. Taking a firm states' right position, Alabama lawmakers in December 1865 decided that only local and state officials should determine the political status of the newly freed population. As a result, they enacted oppressive black codes governing apprenticeship, gun ownership, language, vagrancy, and other matters to regulate the behavior of African Americans. Alabama's black codes, on which no black man voted, attracted national attention. Disgusted by the vagrancy law, which also affected poor whites, a congressman from Maine scoffed at the civilized officials in Alabama who made drunk, stubborn, refractory, or able-bodied citizens who loitered away their time vagrants. The same label was applied to people who allegedly ran away from their employers, and of course the vast majority of those individuals would have been, well, they would have looked like you and I. The Penal Code of Alabama allowed any one of those individuals to be fined $50, which was a large sum during the immediate post-war years. If someone defaulted, then he or she could be hired out on 3 days public notice for up to 6 months, a process that one scholar has aptly labeled slavery by another name. Black Alabamians imprisoned for purportedly speaking foul words to white women, for throwing rocks at sheep, for damaging plates, and other minor or false violations knew about such neo-slavery firsthand. Skeptical that any individual or agency was capable of raising black persons' collective social status to a point where it was equal with whites, one Freedmen's Bureau official's advice to black folks was simple. He advised them not to hope for any grand apology or reparation for being enslaved. Instead, they should go to work and behave. Most emancipated blacks had higher expectations. For them, freedom meant doing what white men could do, such as participate fully in the political process, own land, possess weapons, socialize, and go to school or church without interference. Holland Thompson, a prominent black Baptist and Republican newspaper agent in Mobile, was certain that voting, increased educational opportunities, and land ownership would bring about the speediest elevation of the race. Thompson was among the vanguard of Alabama's free black leadership. In May 1867, following the enactment of the 14th Amendment and the First and Second Reconstruction Acts, as Dr. Robinson mentioned, he was selected to president of a statewide black, or in the words of the era, colored or freedmen's political convention held at the St. Louis Street Church in Mobile. Consistent with radical Reconstruction, delegates requested relief programs for the elderly and for the homeless. They called for an integrated public school system, which Alabama never had during Alabama Reconstruction. And the delegates also asked the federal government to fine or to imprison whites who abused African Americans, a request fulfilled only partly by the Future Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871. Of equal importance, the Freedmen's Convention of 1867 passed a resolution proclaiming all attendees official members of the National Republican Party. Now, here one needs to pause a second, because some individuals, particularly some of the younger students, might think, why would black folks? Let me restate that. Why would African Americans? Restate that. Why would former slaves be a part of the Republican Party? Okay. Let us not look at the Republican Party of the present day. The demographic of the present Republican Party is quite different from the demographic of the 19th century Republican Party, which was oftentimes called the Party of Lincoln. You see, there was a shift that occurred, and a shift that I'm sure that Dr. Robert Norrell will discuss in coming moments. Holland and his associates specifically wanted to hold political office, serve as jurors, and use integrated public facilities. And in one of the strongest political pronouncements that any group of black Alabamans had made to date, Holland and company called those activities absolute rights that any lawful citizen should have been able to enjoy freely. As it turned out, the resolution was of little significance, especially with regard to electoral politics. When Republicans met in convention to choose their slate of candidates for statewide office in 1867, not one black man was nominated. This too is important, considering that approximately 90% of the Republican Party was black. Despite party propaganda, numerous right Republicans were convinced that African Americans were unable to perform tasks that required substantial mental ability, such as making important political decisions. Partial membership and voting were appropriate because former slaves knew how to follow orders, but supporting black office holders was a taboo that many white Republicans dared not break. Nonetheless, in excess of 150 politicians of African descent became office holders before the Democratic Party won the governorship in 1874 and permanently restored conservative rule in Alabama. Again, one might pause because the idea that Alabama's Reconstruction period lasted from 1865 until 1864 is not entirely correct. Alabama actually experienced two restorations of democratic rule, two restorations of democratic redemption, one in 1870 and the second in 1874. Black and white Republicans continued to hold municipal and county-wide offices during Reconstruction, and two blacks, James T. Rapier and Jeremiah Harrison, sat in the United States Congress. But most black and white Republicans were relegated to minor positions on the state level. Benjamin S. Turner, Alabama's only other black congressman during the country's Orthodox Reconstruction period, had been voted out of office in 1872. According to one prominent historian, the first time black and white Alabamans gathered as political equals was at a Republican meeting held in this city, Montgomery, in March 1867. The historian is partly correct. Black and white Republicans did meet that month, but only white persons gave speeches. Black delegates were forced to communicate their concerns in writing. Besides a free press, free speech, and free schools, the black delegates asked white Republicans to adhere to the conditions of the 14th Amendment by making no distinction in civil and political rights on account of color or previous conditions of servitude. The request came directly from the Alabama Republican Party's first state platform, which the black delegate and future United States Congressman James T. Rapier drafted. But white Republicans agreed to comply, but the agreement proved flawed and unenforceable. Pledging to support social equality aligned white Republicans in Alabama with white Republicans in more moderate states. It also attracted more black folks to the party of Lincoln. At no time, however, did leading whites in the former cradle of the Confederacy relinquish power on the state level. An important catchphrase of Alabama Reconstruction was control, a concept understood and employed by white Republicans and Democrats alike during that period and onward. For many white Alabamians, controlling blacks was deemed ineffective unless it was achieved through what one federal investigator referred to as physical compulsion or violence. Furious that African Americans were legally free and on the verge of voting and holding political office, racist whites carried out a veritable reign of terror in Alabama. The Freedmen's Bureau recorded hundreds of cases of violence in the state, including at least 20 murders in 1866 alone. Many of these murders occurred in the Black Belt, where most African Americans lived. In Sumter County, for example, a black man was killed because he refused to sign an unjust labor contract. In Marengo, one county northeast of Sumter, a white man hit a teenage black employee in the head repeatedly with a bat. After a black man from Marengo was fatally shot while working in the field, the white man who committed the crime was never captured and thus sentenced to prison. It was hoped that the election of black officials would stem the tide of violence in the state, which was not limited to the Black Belt. An 1866 issue of the Mobile Nationalist newspaper reported a local black man was horsewhipped in public because he asked a white contemporary to pay an outstanding debt. Another white man from Mobile threatened to shoot a black boy who refused to accept $1 as payment for work that he had performed in a blacksmith shop. In the same city, a black woman's skull was crushed because she dared to proclaim that she was free. The terrorism carried out in Sumter, Marengo, and Mobile counties foreshadowed coming events. Numerous black churches and schools were destroyed, and thousands of blacks and white Republicans were harassed for political reasons. When the state law in 1867 mandated that every county have at least one black registrar for every 2 whites, a white Democrat who refused to be registered by a black man killed the black registrar in Hale County. The murderer was imprisoned, but local blacks helped him to escape. The 1868 state constitution was a major cause of white dissension. In 1875, Leroy Pope Walker, an extremely powerful Alabama Democrat and former Confederate Secretary of State, referred to the document as a piece of unseemly mosaic composed of shreds and patches gathered here and there, incongruous in design, and inharmonious in action, discriminating and oppressive, and utterly lacking in every element to inspire popular confidence and reverence of the people. The Constitution, Walker recalled, was crafted by several independent committees rather than a single body and did not meet the original federal criterion for ratification, 1/2 of all registered voters. It became law solely because the Republican-controlled United States Congress defied President Johnson and pushed through the 4th Reconstruction Act, authorizing state officials to ratify state codes based on a majority of votes actually cast. In Alabama, the federal act nullified the actions of 75,000 white Democrats who boycotted the ratification process to prevent constitutional reform. Meanwhile, an estimated 62,000 blacks ignored white threats to stay home, braved inclement weather, and went to the polls. Walker's objection to how the 1868 Alabama Constitution was drafted and ratified was understandable, but his condemnation of the entire code was flawed. As a matter of fact, the document crafted during the 1875 Constitutional Convention, over which he presided, did not differ much from the previous Constitution, especially with regard to interracial relationships. Despite a long history of biracial unions in Alabama, most white Democrats and Republicans vehemently oppose amalgamation and cohabitation among blacks and whites of any nationality. Both practices were written into the statute as offenses against public and moral decency. If any white person and any Negro, or the descendant of any Negro to the 3rd generation inclusive, through one ancestor of each generation, intermarry or live in adultery or fornication with each other, read the 1868 Constitution, each one of them must, on conviction, be imprisoned in the penitentiary or sentenced to hard labor for the county, not less than 2 nor more than 7 years. Though legal prohibition ceased over the years, the consensus among whites regarding open interracial relationships remained intact. As late as November 2000, that is 13 years removed, the majority of white voters in Alabama opposed mixed unions. Speaking for the majority, a neo-Confederate by the name of Michael Chappelle said, "Interracial marriages is bad for our Southern culture." Because most black Alabamians did not desire to live or have sex with whites in the years following emancipation, they theoretically did not mind an amalgamation or cohabitation clause. During the 1867 Constitutional Convention, for instance, Ovid Gregory, a mulatto, a mixed black person from Mobile, proposed an amendment to allow judges to impose a life sentence on any white man who cohabitated with a black woman. A fellow mulatto delegate, John Caraway, also of Mobile, and James T. Raper were enthusiastic supporters of the proposal. Exactly what prompted it has never been disclosed, but decades of non-consensual affairs between white masters, overseers, boys, and slave women were logical motivations. During Restoration, William H. Council, the same William H. Council who is familiar to all of us here, a mulatto school founder at that time in northern Alabama, was willing to enter into a contract with whites. He said, "We the Negroes agree on our part to hang by the neck until dead any colored man who violates the seventh commandment with a white woman, if you, the white people, will agree to punish according to every law every white man who also violates that seventh commandment with a colored woman. So help us God." The eloquent and sometimes exaggerative counsel was confident that no sensible black would refuse to sign the contract. Conservative whites maintained the number of mulattoes born as a result of forced intercourse was exaggerated. Even if the incidence of unwelcome relations was inflated, black Alabamians had ample reason to detest Jim Crow laws separating them and white people in public and in private areas such as homes. In every type of abode imaginable, from the grandest Greek revival mansion to the shabbiest dog trot, blacks and whites had shared intimacies. One could only imagine how many slaves had comforted their white masters during the times of bereavement, or how many white babes had suckled at the breast of enslaved black women alongside black infants without worrying about polluting the so-called white gene pool. Counsel surmised 95% of the nurses and chambermaids of the South are colored. These servants are thrown in hourly contact with the children of the families they serve and do much to shape the lives of the children they carry in their arms. It is a fact, he said, that Southern white women have been accustomed for many generations to surrender the care and training of their children to black mamas, who inspired and gave the first great lessons of God and truth to the hundreds of the hoary, harried statesmen of the sunny South. This custom, he said, is still a delight in the South. That statement he made in the 1890s. White Alabamians' general opposition to black men voting openly and freely compounded Counsel and his black associates' hatred of Jim Crow. Speaking for countless whites, one prominent white Democrat said mulattoes' European ancestry might make them be somewhat intelligent electors, but making, or extended rather, the vote to all African Americans was unwise. White society, he explained, is not prepared to condescend to compete with the colored race for positions of either honor or profit any more than it is to admit him to social equalities. Such assertions were common, but whites more times than not contended that universal male suffrage and office holding would place Alabama in the hands of unqualified black and greedy white Republicans, or, as Democrats of the time might say, niggers, carpetbaggers, and scalawags, which one individual referred to as an unholy trinity. The Montgomery Advertiser, well, I have comments about that too, but I shall hold them back at this point. The Montgomery Advertiser wrote similarly in 1867. If black politicians held public office on a significant scale, the newspaper contended, former slaves would control as many as 10 southern states, Alabama being one of them. White Southerners had not shed blood during the American Civil War merely to see another Santo Domingo come into being, the newspaper concluded. Before that happened, it stated, conservative whites in the state would re-enslave or kill every black person in Alabama, and that is a quote. Usually the Advertiser and similar statements were mere cant, because political victories in Alabama depended on black votes. Othello was courted, though never married, to ensure political success. Not even in the Union League, which the Freedmen's Bureau helped Northern Republicans organize, did an earnest concern for universal equality outweigh the personal interests of many white educators, ministers, politicians, and other self-styled well-doers. In 1877, Judge Milton Saffold, a white Democrat turned Republican, admitted, "I expect to vote and act with whatever party will, for the time being, serve my purpose, which I avow to be, and ever have been, my protection." Most opportunistic white Republicans were less direct than Saffold, but their interests were the same. Clearly, and contrary to the prevalent views of whites concerning Negro rule during Reconstruction, white Alabamians were the stars of their own political productions. and it was understood well that blacks would be cast to fill supporting roles or they would be confined to watch. The federal mandate to reconstitute the former Confederacy during the late 1860s provided white Alabama lawmakers an excellent opportunity to show how committed to Reconstruction they were. A desegregated public school system, for instance, could have served as an exemplar of racial reconciliation for other southern states. But rather than integrating the classroom, lawmaking Alabamians kept it segregated. State legislators were blamed for the decision, but they should not have borne the burden alone. The State Education Board discussed desegregation following the ratification of the 1868 Constitution, but members decided against it in the end. An inevitable white backlash was the main reason the board stopped talking about desegregation. Despite repeat pleas by black and progressive white voters and politicians, state legislators pledged, but never fully allocated, enough money to effectively run the state's black and white schools. As a result, thousands of teachers were paid late or with virtually worthless state notes, or in some cases, they were not paid at all. Something that I'm certain some of you know a bit about. In January 1874, the white Republican Joseph Speed, who lived in Perry County, which was the home, of course, of the Lincoln School, later to become the Lincoln Normal School, later to become the Alabama State Colored University, or simply the U, and ultimately Alabama State University, delivered a report to the governor. At the time, Speed served as the state superintendent of education. Poor County, Speed said, were not generating enough revenue through local taxes to effectively operate their schools, and the state needed more qualified and energetic instructors. Such concerns did not constitute an epiphany, he noted. The teachers know it, the county superintendents are aware of it, intelligent parents feel it, and the children suffer for it. Using economics and religion to bolster his argument for change, Speed declared, "No man who hires a laborer on his plantation will fail to look after him. No prudent housewife neglects to oversee the work being done by those she employs. How much more important, then, that every parent should take an active interest in that most important of all delegated work, the education of the children received as a holy trust from the Almighty Father." To drive home this point, Steve highlighted the achievement of the Lincoln Normal School in Marion, a black institution, of course, located in Perry County. Perry County was a social and political anomaly during Alabama Reconstruction, and I point to this because the institution that ultimately would become Alabama State University was founded there. Perry County was even more anomalistic for the Black Belt. As we've already discussed, there were several extremely violent activities that took place during Reconstruction, but Perry was relatively peaceful. Despite a sizable and very active black electorate, the vast majority of black Alabamans did not enjoy the rights and privileges that emancipation offered. Besides the continuous possibility of violence, most blacks were denied access to the same public facilities as whites. They were prohibited from obtaining or retaining employment free from interference. They were kept from voting as they wished, and they were also denied the right to judge and be judged by people of the same ethnicity during legal proceedings. Black attempts to secure private land and become homeowners were hindered not only by financial inadequacy, wartime destruction, farming trouble, and government apathy, but also by native whites who feared the loss of labor and the increased independence that land owning would bring. The political plan that most white Alabamans supported was summarized tersely in a Democratic editorial published in the Jacksonville Republican in 1874. It wrote, "This is a white man's government, formed by white men, and should be ruled by white men. Rather trite, but we'll stand on that," for 1874. Conservative white Alabamians stood together much longer than the Democratic editorialists anticipated. For the next century, every Alabama governor was a white Democrat. Despite a sizable black population, an active black electorate, and several willing and capable black office seekers, Reconstruction-era Alabama had no black governor, no black lieutenant governor, no black secretary of state, no black commissioner of agriculture or commissioner of industry. Nor did Alabama have black state auditors, state treasurers, or state superintendents of education. In fact, not one African American was appointed or elected to a statewide office from 1867 through 1874. Up till now, this cycle has not been broken. Although black politicians in Alabama hold more elective offices per capita than in any other state in the country, their positions are not statewide. The closest that African Americans have come to achieving political equality on the state level has been to sit in the state legislature and to attend political conventions alongside other racial, ethnic, and ancestry groups. These facts point to one oftentimes downplayed but obvious fact. The socio-political color line in this state has yet to be erased. That idea might be trite, but it certainly is true. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. English. Are there any questions?
We'll take them after Mr. Gabriel,
Afterwards?
after the whole panel.
After the whole panel, okay. Next, we have Dr. Byrdie Larkin.
And before Dr. Larkin gets started, she'll try to work on her. First of all, I'd like to thank the National Center for inviting me to participate in this panel. I participated on a lot of national panels. I've been an Oxford Scholar and a Fulbright Scholar, where I have been allowed to discuss civil rights. And so to do it at the National Center, I thank you very much. This is the second panel on campus for voting rights. Last spring, the Department of History and Political Science and the National Political Science Honor Society also sponsored a panel on voting rights. My area of specialization usually is on national voting rights legislation. That means the 1965 legislation. So when Dr. Robinson issued the invitation, he also gave me a homework assignment because he put me back in the 1800s. And I've enjoyed the assignment, and I hope you will too. I had to call him back though to get clarity about the dates, because I know historians use dates and we didn't want to overlap each other. And I think my presence on this panel is also significant because I'm between two gentlemen and I'm sandwiched in. There is going to be a bit of an overlap somewhat, so let me get started. Can you just bring it up just a little bit, almost to the top of the screen? And I thank you very much. You have skills I don't have. African Americans had successfully challenged white supremacy, became citizens, and participated in the political system. But the Republicans, which Dr. English mentioned, because African Americans were part of the Republican Party, he also explained that. But Republicans and the federal government's commitment to African Americans wavered and collapsed by the 1870s. So that's really when my discussion begins. Even poor white farmers who had aligned themselves with freed slaves were convinced their alliance was untenable. Most of the federal troops had left Alabama by 1872. And obviously, you know, federal troops were in the southern states to protect the former slaves and also to make sure that Reconstruction was carried out properly. Therefore, Reconstruction formally came to an end via the Compromise of 1876. Most of the South's returning white leaders identified themselves as conservative Democrats. Their main objective was to nullify the strength of African American voters by disenfranchising them. Conclusively, political scientists, the late Haynes Walton and Robert Smith, have identified 1890 to 1901 as the era of disenfranchisement, when all 11 states of the Confederacy adopted new state constitutions that prevented, prohibited, or manipulated African American voting rights. For the purposes of this conference and the results of my research, I contend that the era of disenfranchisement began in 1870. And why were whites so concerned about taking away voting rights? Well, you can see it up on your screen. Probably not as clear as it needs to be. I'm going to pinpoint several points, but just as today, which concerns me greatly because of Shelby, African Americans were very successful in their voting opportunities. Dr. English has pointed out some of those successes, but in national government, Blanche K. Bruce and Hiram Revels were national officials, part of the Congress. Jasper Wright was appointed to the Supreme Court. However, as has been stated, the majority of African Americans sat in state legislatures and held local offices. I think the true effectiveness of Reconstruction was the constitutions, because the constitutions extended the suffrage, which is the right to vote. Governmental representation was based on population. It did recognize some aspect of women's rights, although women would not get full participation in the political system until the next century. It reformed the penal code. It replaced many appointed offices with elected ones. So there was a great need for returning Bourbons, not the liquor, but white conservative Democrats, to offset the progression of the African American vote. According to John Hope Franklin, violence, and Mr. Cable, would you take the screen up maybe to the next? Okay, keep going. Okay, as you can see, not only are my computer skills limited, but I started typing and the size of my characters changed on me and I was off of it. But you can see that what I've listed here for my discussion are the ways in which African Americans were disenfranchised during this period. According to John Hope Franklin, violence remained the surest means for keeping African Americans politically impotent. Rebecca B. Groover writes that many criminals were operating under the cover of the Ku Klux Klan. Ever heard of them? And its activities became so outrageous that its own leader denounced the organization and ordered it disbanded by 1869. The Klan's actions were directly responsible for the Congressional Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, which placed elections under federal jurisdiction, gave the president the right to suspend habeas corpus, declare martial law, and impose fines and sentences on those convicted of interfering with any citizen's right to vote. However, few people were indicted under these acts. Virginia Van der Ver Hamilton, and maybe you historians are familiar with that name, but when I ran across her book, I was like, okay, this is a German woman probably writing about Alabama history. But she reveals that the Klan was particularly active in Black Belt America. Let me pause here and underscore something Dr. English said. Blacks were imported from Africa via South America, but through the Black Belt in America became that large area where you had most blacks living. And even after slavery, they resided there. So that area will appear in my discussion many times, as it has already appeared, because the Black Belt area was the large area where African Americans resided. So there was great violence in this area. In Alabama in 1874, black and white Republican leaders were murdered, and white mobs destroyed crops and homes. On election day in Eufaula, how many of you know where Eufaula